Hello there, and welcome to Weird Music on the Glumburger channel. It's of course a strange music show with the weird, unusual presenter doing their best to talk about a different album each and every week, right? So of course, as you no doubt already know, this is our return to the wonderful world of Swans, with a look at, the next studio album in their repertoire at this current point in time. So previously, we discussed the album Anonymous Bodies in an Empty Room, which is an interesting live album that sort of bridges the gap between a lot of the different music that was being written around this current era, including songs from the Burning World, with World of Skin songs, and a few tracks from this very album we're looking at today. And so I feel like when it comes to this album, I feel like this is, where we're finally getting what a kind of sense of what Gira wanted to achieve on the Burning World, or at least in my opinion, that kind of vibe, sound, that was that's present on this album. It might have been what would have better suited the Burning World, but I've made my opinions very clear on that album. It's in the video. To be fair though, with this one, I do like a lot of what's going on here. You get a lovely sort of classic rock style embedded in a lot of the tracks, from acoustic guitars to ballads, as well as some intense moments from time to time. Very excited to talk about it, as, like I said, this is genuinely one of my favourites from Swans, so let's discuss it, shall we? Today I present White Light from the Mouth of Infinity by Swans. So of course, let's ask ourselves, who were Swans when White Light from the Mouth of Infinity was released? Well, this is a bit of an interesting lineup for Swans. A very varied selection of musicians, some who just sort of came and went during this era of Swans, some who just showed up just recording the album, some who joined for a little bit of time, and a couple of others who've stuck around for a very long time, or will stick around for longer. So to start with, of course, we have the one and only Michael Gira, performing vocals, backing vocals, acoustic guitar, keyboards, effects, samples, and production duties as well. And then joined, of course, by Jarbo, also performing vocals and backing vocals, as well as keyboards and choral and orchestral arrangements. And then next we have the appearance of a name that we're going to come to know a lot more of in the future years. And that is the one and only Christoph Hahn, performing acoustic and electric guitar. As well, we also have one Clinton Steele, who also performs acoustic and electric guitar on this album. We then apparently have the appearance of one Jenny Wade performing bass guitar, who, I'll be honest, is a name I don't know much about and wasn't actually able to find out a lot of information about, so bit of a mystery in terms of their basis on this one. As well, though, they are joined by Anton Fear on drums and drum programming, Nikki Skopoletis on acoustic and electric guitar, Baglama, bouzouki, and banjo as well. Vincent Signorelli on percussion, Han Ro on violin, and then Steve Berg on mandolin and 12-string guitar. So of course there's one name you might have noticed we haven't mentioned yet, and that is of course the one and only Norman Westberg, who, as far as my research has shown me, he does feature on this album, but from what I know, or have found out, only plays electric guitar on the very first track of Better Than You. So yeah, apparently this is sort of like, the beginning of an era where we're going to see a lot less of Norman Westberg in the coming studio releases. I mean, of course, knowing the full history, we know everything's going to be fine, he will come back and join the band, but yeah, it's kind of interesting that this is sort of, the time when we're going to see a little less of him, is what it is, of course. And so, what is White Light from the Mouth of Infinity? Well, this is of course the band's 1991 album release, which was released as the third official release for the recently established Young God Records. Yes, so as far as I know, this is actually the first time we're mentioning Young God Records on the channel, apparently, as far as I know. So let's quickly actually ask, what is Young God Records? Well, it is of course the record label formed by Jira to facilitate the release of Swans music, which includes both old and new albums, and then in later years became much more of a sort of, outlet for very strange, experimental, avant-garde, or different types of music, essentially. And so, as its third official release, we got White Light from the Mouth of Infinity, one of the best Swans albums, in my opinion, in their whole repertoire. I feel like I genuinely place this album up there with the likes of, Children of God, which was, not too long ago in terms of its history, or even Soundtracks of the Blind, that comes in a bit later. I just really love how there's this phenomenal dark, menacing rock album here that just really gets under your skin at times. But as well, it just feels so much bigger and grander than anything Swans have done before in their careers, especially with how the music sounds on a lot of these songs. You just get this lovely expansive sound, like standing in the middle of an empty field on a hot day with the sun shining high up above. A bit of a weird vibe for Swan, but it also makes a little bit of sense as well. In any case, let's discuss the songs then, shall we? So, White Light opens up with the album opener, Better Than You. And so our immediate opener is one of the sounds of a small baby child, just gurgling away before, for quite a little bit of time, I would say, just setting the scene, I'd say, before the song just suddenly smashes into the scene with this heavy descent of bass and high-end keys and pounding drums that just rattle the skull as the guitars fuzz and whine over the whole thing. It is a very intimidating opening, punctuated all the more so by that odd little opener, and it gives it a very intense start, that intense start so much more impact, I feel. It's a wild rush, into what I would say is sort of familiar Swans territory until the song begins, cued by the acoustic guitar as, Jira just sings that customary croon, of course. And the soundscapes here, they're very odd, I find. They're kind of like, the combination of various instruments heard on The Burning World, but I think it's a bit more impactful here, though. Flutes in the high end creates disturbing sense of wariness, elevating Jira's unusual lyrics of that weird power play that comes up a lot in his lyrics, of course. And of course it's bombarded by that refrain of "I'm so glad I'm better than you," which kind of feels like being addressed by Jira himself. It's kind of just judging us. But it's the reverses that reveal a sense of introspection, where he's actually turned it upon himself, judging his own self, if that makes sense. And it throws the song into more of a sort of sense of despairing darkness and sort of existentialism, I feel, which is a theme that comes up a lot in this album. But to go back to the song, there's just so many wonderful dynamics, from the heavy, intense instrumental passages and the softer sounding but more intimidating feeling verses as well, like really just creates these lovely little moments to and fro. And it perfectly paves the way for what this album will be offering us, intense dynamic Swans, moving from heaviness to softness with an underlying element of malice, contempt and anger. And so the next track of Power and Sacrifice, this one opens up with a sort of unusual ambient soundscape of sorts before the twangling guitar line introduces us to the melody before it becomes a ferocious roar as the rest of the band joins in on that menacing beat. And with, Jira just crooning so deeply with that baritone voice, it sounds so intimidating, but so exciting to hear, I have to say. There's just something so cool about how so much of the instrumental sounds on this album. And to me, this one kind of feels like those more intense parts that were heard on the likes of the previous albums of Children of God and Burning World, but feels like it's been pushed out tenfold with this incredible presence here. And everything just feels so threatening, so full of malice once again, as though we're witness to cataclysmic events. A real sense of urgency, from each of the musicians to add to that panic-attacking melody and rhythm. And I just love how after the phenomenal opener, the album's continued, with another absolute banger of a song, a further continuation of, the egotistical themes, explored in the opener, as well as that, menacing musical style. And so the next track of You Know Nothing, this one opens up with a really lovely drone, I have to say, letting the jangle of guitar notes, lead the way for some beautiful Jarbo vocalizations. And as soon as she starts singing, I have to say, it becomes so lovely to listen to, There's something charming and quaint about it. Of course, with how Gira sings, that wonderful baritone comes in, and it does leave these kind of affected emotions on the very words themselves as we sort of see him exploring a sense of peace that comes with the idea of, like, accepting how little we know in this world, if that makes sense, like the futility of actions and acknowledgement. In a weird way, how, accepting of how little we know can be a very freeing thing in of itself, maybe. It's at least what I get from the song, like maybe that makes no sense at all. I should say, to go back to the song, I love how there's a lovely build-up, from the verses into the chorus, which seems to really change the scene as a sort of like swinging, swaying type instrumental, as, Gira tells us, you know nothing at all, repeated over and over. Perhaps, expressing a disconnect between Gira and himself, arguably, pointing the finger at himself and saying, in these many instances, there's nothing he knows. Weirdly enough, an expression of self-doubt, which is a theme that comes up on this album as well from time to time. I should have mentioned as well, before we finish talking about this song, following the second cycle of the chorus, we do get a wonderfully intense dirge though, where the drums become so much more militant as we get more distortion in the guitars. And it becomes that classic Swans miasma of just falling backwards into the swirling clouds, letting it all just wash over you. Before you know it, we're just back at that charming quaint opening again, the sound of those gentle acoustics and lovely Jarbo vocalizations once more. I think a genuinely fascinating track of the album that really captures to me that an oddly skewed and unique atmosphere in amongst those various movements, as well as also having hints of, the latest Swan style, I would say, just at little times, I think. From here, we move on to Song for a Dead Time. And this one opens up with acoustic pattern, falling on a very specific beat, that brings with it a swell of synths and guitar fuzz, as you get a rather bleak and empty atmosphere, which then leads the way for Jarbo's lead vocals on this one. And I love the performative aspect on this. I find it lovely hearing how Jarbo sings, with that effortless control of her voice, carrying the melody all the way to the chorus, just to express that really dark, heavy, menacing attitude once more. I have to say, this one's a rather slow burner of a track, especially, with how slowly it develops and stuff, which I think it's actually a bit of a quality I'm noticing in a bunch of the Jarbo-led songs, which is not a bad thing. It's just kind of interesting that this has come up a couple of times. Most of them anyway, of course. But to be fair, what I do like though is how, especially bringing it to a bit more of a crawl though, it does create very interesting moments on the Swans albums and really helps to diversify the incredible range to their very sounds. Hello there, future glumburger here. You can tell by the shades, I guess. So past glumburger forgot to discuss the next track on the album, Will We Survive? Kind of stupid for me to have forgotten to talk about this one, as this is another one of those brilliant standout tracks from this album in my opinion, and to be fair, this was a standout on the last album we discussed as well, but more on that later. So this one opens up with those incredibly huge, resounding drums. From there, the whole song, it just pounds away basically, just following alongside Jarbo's vocalizations and a lovely descending and rather heavy riff from the rest of the instruments. And to me, it's one of those things that just sounds so big, especially with how the whole thing sounds, like it's all just reaching out into vast expanse and just as far as it can let them essentially. So as mentioned when we did discuss this one on Anonymous Bodies previously, and I remember actually musing to myself whether I thought the live version of that album was better or if the studio version was better, and I think it's a no-brainer. The studio version that we've got on White Light is so just amazing, perfect. Like, to be fair, the Anonymous Bodies in an Empty Room version, it does capture that amazing energy that the song offers, but I just really like how the whole thing sounds on White Light from Mouth of Infinity. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure there's really good live versions of it, and Anonymous Bodies does capture, the essence of the very good live versions. It just still doesn't sound great in terms of the quality. Whereas here, everything just sounds so brilliant, I have to say, and it's so cool to hear. But yeah, I just love how this one, it just captures that massive stadium sound, and I love how as well how it all just builds up and up with the lyrics, with the vocals, and then with these instrumental passages, and then towards the end, you get a wonderful instrumental flurry that just builds this another one of those big swirling miasmas that's so prevalent on this album. It just sounds like this amazing freefall experience to the very clouds themselves at this point, right up to the very end of it all. An incredibly exciting track, and weirdly enough, it's one that's even kind of abstract at times with, the lyrics, especially on its existential musing on survival. But even with that, it still has this really joyous energy that is just so perfect to hear every time. Anyway, back to past glumburger. So, moving swiftly along, I think we get to, what I'd argue is, a very phenomenal standout track on this album, and it was actually one of my first favourite Swan songs, if that makes sense, and that is Love Will Save You. I don't know, maybe the most Joy Division of all the Swan songs, perhaps. You've got a very interesting acoustic pattern, a jangle of, the guitars, and a very slow crawl punctuated by the smash of the snare, which then just gives Jira his cue to just begin that miserable baritone croon. And what I adore in this track is that really grumpy and downright miserable aesthetic that expresses itself through the entire track, from the instrumentals to how he sings of just love saving you from different situations, but of course ultimately never saving him specifically. And as a result, it feels incredibly cynical, a love song that doesn't believe in the power of love, if that makes sense. Very interesting, I have to say. To go back to the track though, musically it does travel to various parts though. You get sort of a joyous moment in the second chorus of But It Won't Save Me, where it's like you've got the bum 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 type of thing going on. But of course, it is marred by that cynical tone throughout. As mentioned, for me this was always one of my top favourite tracks on this album when I first discovered it, many years ago when I first decided to check out Swans, What I love is just that darkness and macabre nature that runs throughout the entire track, an aesthetic of self-loathing that's so prevalent in so many of the songs he writes, Definite favourite of mine, and, I'm always glad to hear this one whenever it shows up, to be fair. Moving swiftly along though, we get another popular track from, this current iteration of Swans, but I think this is actually a popular track amongst, fans of the band actually, and that is the studio recording of Failure. And so this one feels very dominated by that acoustic guitar, really highlighting Jira's sense of presence, with just his voice and the barest of instrumentals to back up this incredibly self-loathing track. And this feels, to me, perhaps like a culmination of so much of what Jira has worked his entire life building up towards, continuing to push out this oddly skewed, unique vision, only to falter consistently in every moment it feels, perhaps with his only achievement being his failure as an artist. At least that's what I get when reading the lyrics, of course. It does interest me that this particular song, just to go on a bit of a tangent, this particular song does follow on chronologically from the band's previous studio album of The Burning World, which I suppose, in terms of a major record release, was a major failure in many ways. Though I do wonder if the very experience jaded, Michael Jira so much that, it led to maybe writing this very song. I don't know for sure. But it's just interesting that this song does really revel in just this miserable, cynical self-look, at the very situation and process of being an artist, being a musician, trying to do your life's work, if that makes sense. At least that's how I interpret it, of course. But I have to say, I do love the dark, brooding atmosphere in this one. It does revel in that self-loathing and disappointing vibe that feels, a very familiar sentiment, from Jira, of course, right? But it's interesting, of course, that meta element as well this particular track has captured in context of where Swans were and have been at this current point in time, if that makes sense. Moving swiftly along, we get the next track of Song for the Sun. Another song about the sun. Random tangent again. I think the only other person who sings about the sun as much as Michael Jira might actually be Tim DeLaughter of the Polyphonic Spree, from what I know. The first album, the beginning stages of the Polyphonic Spree, a lot of songs about the sun. Very cool. Of course, when Jira sings about the sun, it's usually a lot more miserable. However, this is a nice, cool one though. It feels like to me a little bit more like a conventional alt-rock song, lots of glorious sounding instrumentals, a nice dry push by the drums, Michael Jira's customary low-end croon over the top of it all, and Jarbo vocalising in the background. It makes for a really nice song, which in the context of Swans is kind of a weird thing at this stage. But the song just wonderfully gives off that energy you get from just standing out in warm sunlight, and it's just lovely, I have to say. And midway through, you do get a sort of quieter section that brings it all down to this sort of, very quiet acoustic guitar note with the vocals and some ambient swells in the background, before it then transforms the sounds into a violin, I think. And then before you know it, you're back to that glorious sentiment that the song introduced to us right at the very beginning. A really nice song on the album, and kind of a nice little palate cleanser in terms of, just getting over like the very dark emotions that a lot of the album explores. And so, another favourite of mine, Miracle of Love. This, has a very wonderfully dark, moody and sinister atmosphere, I have to say. We did discuss this track previously in our episode covering Anonymous Bodies in an Empty Room, but here we have the official studio release finally. And what I find interesting is how, that slightly flawed but interesting live album did show us a lot of context for how certain songs were sounding, especially in regards to The Burning World, of course, but as mentioned, it showcases that those songs connect to songs from this very album, including Miracle of Love, which popped up as the closing track for that album, I think it was. And what's really nice is to now hear the studio album in this context, and hearing how they've managed to capture that same attitude and menacing, dark, foreboding, brooding nature that permeated through the live recording as well. Pushed along by the jangle of guitar notes and that menacing bass line as well. What's nice on this one, though, on the studio version, we get some lovely string section as well, those orchestral arrangements, and it's really nice in the mix to just extenuate that sense of tension, I feel. Especially with how slow this whole thing is. It's very interesting when it then becomes a cataclysmic break midway into the song, when the band just goes full force, cued by the glide of a guitar before they all just push out that amazing dirge. And I really like, what the band does in this section, I have to say. It does this intense building riff of sort that builds, pushes forward, a sense of ferocity and terror. To me, it feels like, those miasmas is how I describe it, especially in Swans music, where, especially in the likes of the trilogy songs, for example, where everything just swells and swells around and around with this dizzying energy. Before, on this track though, it all just circles down the very drain itself towards the end, with a very weird piano section to actually close off the entire song. Genuinely, one of my favourite Swans tracks, one of my favourite things off of White Light and the Mouth of Infinity, of course. But speaking of favourites, the next track is another favourite of mine, though its inclusion here is a little bit confusing in some respects. So for the release of White Light that I've got here, which is also packaged with Love of Life and the live album Omniscience as well, we'll get to those in future episodes. But yeah, with this particular version, which was released not too long ago at this point, there's a lot of remastering and remixing for the tracks, just remastering it a bit, some songs extended and bits like that. But as well, they sought to add one more song into the track listing, and that is the very interesting track of Blind. So of course, Blind does make an appearance in the Michael Gira solo album of Drainland as its final track. Here though, it's been squashed into the track listing of White Light, and although these things do kind of confuse me sometimes, I do like to hear albums as they were originally released. As this is the version I've got, I just thought I'd review Blind anyway, and to be fair, I actually like how Blind kind of adds into the atmosphere that this whole album presents though. It does express to me a lot of the same common themes being expressed on the whole album though, that dark, depressing sense of existentialism of one's place in the world. And musically, it's also dominated by acoustic jangles and lovely backing vocals that, on this song, remind me a lot of the kind of things heard on Push the Sky Away by Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. But this one though, a definite favourite of mine, because I just love the really sad, melancholy atmosphere that comes through with the instrumentals and with Gira's voice here, and I do think it fits nicely into the multitude of different vibes the whole album's expressing to us, ranging from fear and terror to just heartbreaking anguish at times. To move along though, we get the next track of When She Breathes. Bit of an interesting one, but I'll be honest, not one I know all that much about, but I've tried to write some thoughts about it anyway. So this one opens up with a very simple yet effective bass line that kind of pounces out from the dark, alongside a chime of twinkling notes and ambient vocals, before Jarbo takes away on the lead vocals again. And I like how her voice sounds on this one. To me, it reminds me a lot of that really sinister attitude that you get from the likes of Beth Gibbons of Portishead. And it's a lovely vocal performance in Jarbo though, perfectly matching that intimidating bass line that just pushes so slowly into the song. But there's also some nice textures, scattered throughout as well, which never seem to devolve into manic distortion, though it does build with the chorus section, if you can call it a chorus section of sorts. But it's definitely an interesting track, and it's always nice hearing Jarbo take away the lead vocals on a lot of the songs, I always just like hearing how, her various leads kind of showcase a bit more variety to the Swans' sound that, at the same time still ties into their aesthetic. It's perhaps, though, one of the strengths of Swans as a band, though, that at any point, most of the people who were present in the band at whatever point in time, they always seem to be buying into the vision of what Swans are trying to do, and trying to express Jira's vision as well. And I feel like Jarbo is one of the people who really understood that kind of thing, if that makes sense. The penultimate track, Why Are We Alive? Bit of an existential question, right? So this one has a bit of an interesting opener, I have to say. An acoustic riff looping over this odd little clean guitar tone. And then a lovely interplay between the bass and the drums that just kind of spins around once again and really reminds me, once again, of the later years of Swans. Genuinely the kind of stuff that you see like Chris Pradovica do with Phil Puello, I think. Like there's little bits that they kind of do with each other. And I feel like this track does kind of explore some similar things of just, the interplay between drums and bass. In any case though, that is kind of true until it all just drops into the main song, which is another glorious tune that ascends upwards when the drums start pounding away and pushing the song along at that wonderful middle tempo, before bringing it back to that ascending glorious star with strings and minimal piano notes. But there's something fantastic about it, and it's nice seeing the Swans, really letting those musical layers develop over long periods of time, giving to us as an audience, time to appreciate the nuances of everything that we're hearing before he even starts singing on this one. And when he does, this is another miserable existential introspective dirge, of course. A track examining the absurdity of being, I would argue. What does it mean to be? Why are we alive? Etc. But I have to say, I do always love songs that explore existentialism and the idea of pondering our very existence. It's a theme that comes up a lot in a lot of the artists I gravitate towards, if that makes sense, and something that Jira does explore in a bunch of his lyrics on a bunch of his songs, and it's fascinating to me when it does show up from time to time, and I like how he's explored it lyrically on this one in particular as well. Like, it's very interesting, in my opinion. So of course we move on to the final track, and that is The Most Unfortunate Lie. And as soon as this one starts, it kind of feels like we're in for something a little bit different, as we're given sort of a gentle, sort of folksy melody, pushed by gentle chimes, as, that melody, just plays like, it kind of feels like, to me, the kind of like odd folk music you'd get from the Cult in the middle of nowhere, right? But there's a lot of character being presented in this one, it feels like a sort of episodic with the way Jira just talks his way through the lyrics, before singing away in a rather Nick Cave style for the chorus, once again, more comparisons to Nick Cave. But there's an odd gentle style to this track, contrasted by the dark introspective nature of the lyrics that feels once again like another moment of introspection of, Jira looking within and trying to express this peculiar sense of who he is and has been. And kind of ending on a devastating blow to the ego, I would say, But to go back to it musically, it's quaint and gentle, but there is a darkness and menace, a sort of suspicion lying underneath it all. And I personally feel like this is, once again, kind of like how songs from the Burning World should have sounded, especially those more menacing ones, It's a good example of something gentle in terms of sound, but it doesn't lose that dark macabre nature that forms the making of a great Swan song. And it's really cool how they've ended it on this note as well, like this, just a very strong note to end it on that's, a little bit different from the very big bombastic openings we've had, but still so dark in its own right. And so from there, we've essentially finished covering White Light from the Mouth of Infinity. What an album, I have to say. This was a bit of a difficult one for me to really get through. Not because it was boring, don't get me wrong, but rather because every song was so brilliantly interesting in its own right that it was just very hard to really articulate all the thoughts. And as well, it's quite a long album actually, especially with the inclusion of Blind on there. I'm pretty sure that up to this point in time, at this current point in time, this is the longest Swans album we've looked at so far. It of course means nothing in the face of their later years, don't get me wrong, but, that's for later. For now, this is the longest one we've had a look at. Don't know if it's going to be the longest video, but whatever. But in any case, I just love how there's a kind of alt rock style to this one. Something that feels weirdly a little bit more accessible and conventional than anything Swans have released before, but yet still perfectly bathed in that dark, menacing, introspective, existential attitude and vibe that Swans are so phenomenal at expressing, of course. And easily one of my favourites of all time, I think. Something that whenever I sit down to hear it, I'm just always in awe of how great everything sounds in it, And after having really tried to dive into the grit of it, what I also really like is, I'm always surprised each and every time I hear the album, because there's always something new or exciting that reveals itself to me in, like a particular passage of a song that didn't come across in the right way the first time you heard it. Like, little things always pop up on this album, and I think it's really cool that happens every time I hear this one. Plus, it's got some lovely instrumental passages and a really good variety of them, where sometimes the band just goes for it, or other ones where they just, bring it all back down to sort of, this sort of gentle crawl kind of thing, Or other times back into climbing, soaring, majestic music. Yeah, a definite favourite. Glad to have discussed this one. And so with that, we have of course come to our end of our episode of Weird Music. Not really sure else I need to say about White Light from the Mouth of Infinity. Probably a bunch I have forgotten to mention, but the main thing is always to try talk about what the music makes us feel, if that makes sense. As mentioned, of course, this was, one of the first Swans albums I went to listen to after discovering the band from when they actually first released the album To Be Kind. That was when I first heard Swans and was like, whoa. And then the first album I went to check out was White Light. And I just remember, just adoring that sort of alt gothic rock style that they were doing at this current time, full of menacing macabre and this brilliant ascension towards the sun itself. Definitely one of their best, if you ask me. So yeah, in our next episode, we will of course be looking at White Light's sister album of Love of Life. In any case, I would like to thank you for watching today's episode of Weird Music. In case some of you don't know, all album suggestions that are given in the comments now get added onto a randomizer. We try to get through one a month, so it might just be your very suggestions that's chosen for the next one. We will see what happens, right? In any case, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I wish you all the best. Take care. Bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.